Chapter 2. On board the Dwn Trdr. "Ah, there you are, Lucy," said Caspian. "We were just waiting for you. This is my captain, the Lord Drinian." A dark-haired man went down on one knee and kissed her hand. The only others present were Reepicheep and Edmund. "Where's Eustace?" asked Lucy. "In bed," said Edmund, "and I don't think we can do anything for him. It only makes him worse if you try to be nice to him." "Meanwhile," said Caspian, "we want to talk." "By Jove, we do," said Edmund. "And first, about time. It's a year ago by our time since we left you just before your coronation. How long has it been in Narnia?" "Exactly 3 years," said Caspian. "All going well?" asked Edmund. "You don't suppose I'd have left my kingdom and put to sea unless all was well," answered the king. "It couldn't be better. There's no trouble at all now between the Telmarines, dwarves, talking beasts, fauns, and the rest. And we gave up those troublesome giants on the frontier. We gave those troublesome giants on the frontier such a good beating last summer that they pay us tribute now. And I had an excellent person to leave as regent while I'm away. Trumpkin, the dwarf. You remember him?" "Dear Trumpkin," said Lucy. "Of course I do. You couldn't have made a better choice." "Loyal as a badger, ma'am, and as valiant as a mouse," said Drinian. He had been going to say "as a lion," but he had noticed Reepicheep's eyes fixed on him. "And where are we heading for?" asked Edmund. "Well," said Caspian, "that's rather a long story. Perhaps you remember that when I was a child my usurping uncle Miraz got rid of 7 friends of my father's, who might have taken my part, by sending them off to explore the unknown eastern seas beyond the lone islands." "Yes," said Lucy, "and none of them ever came back." "Right. Well, on my coronation day, with Aslan's approval, I swore an oath that, if once I established peace in Narnia, I would sail east myself for a year and a day to find my father's friends, or to learn of their deaths and avenge them, if I could. These were their names: the Lord Revlian, the Lord Byrne, the Lord Arsgaz, and the Lord Mavamorn, the Lord Ortezen, the Lord Restamar, and, oh, that other one who's so hard to remember." "The Lord Roop, sire," said Drinian. Roop, of course," said Caspian. "That's my main intention, but Reepicheep here has an even higher hope." Everyone's eyes turned to the mouse. "As high as my spirit," it said, "though perhaps as small as my stature. Why should we not come to the very eastern end of the world? And what might we find there? I expect to find Aslan's own country. It is always from the east, across the sea, that the great lion comes to us." "I say, that is an idea," said Edmund in an odd voice. "But do you think," said Lucy, "Aslan's country would be the sort of country, the sort you could ever sail to?" "I do not know, madam," said Reepicheep, "but there is this. When I was in my cradle, a wood woman, a dryad, spoke this verse over me: 'Where sky and water meet, where waves grow sweet, doubt not, Reepicheep, you will find all you seek. There is the utter east.' I do not know what it means, but the spell of it has been on me all my life." After a short silence, Lucy asked, "And where are we now, Caspian?" "The captain can tell you much better than I," said Caspian. So Drinian got out his chart and spread it on the table. "That's our position," he said, laying his finger on it. "Or was at noon today. We had a fair wind from the Car Parval, and stood a little north from Galma, where we made on the next day. We were in port for a week, for the Duke of Galma made a great tournament for his Majesty, and there he unhorsed many knights, and got a few nasty falls myself, Drinian. Some bruises are still there," put in Caspian. "And unhorsed many knights," repeated Drinian with a grin. "We thought the Duke would have been pleased if the King's Majesty could have married his daughter, but nothing came of that. Squints and has freckles," says Caspian. "Oh, poor girl," said Lucy. "And we sailed from Galma," continued Drinian, "and ran into a calm for the best of 2 days, and had to row, and then had wind again, and did not make Terabithia Terebinthia till the 4th day from Galma, and there their king sent out a warning not to land, for there was a sickness in Terebinthia. But we doubled the cape, and put it in at a little creek far from the city, and watered. There we had to lie off for 3 days before we got a south-east wind, and stood out for the 7 Isles. The 3rd day out, a pirate, Terebinthian by her rig, overhauled us, but when she saw us well armed, she stood off after some shooting of arrows on either part. And we ought to have given her chase and boarded her, and hanged every mother's son of them, said Reepicheep. And in 5 days we were in 5 days more we were in sight of Mully, which, as you know, is the westernmost of the 7 Isles. Then we rowed through the straits and came about sundown into Redhaven on the Isle of Bren, where we were lovingly feasted and had victual and water at will. We left Redhaven 6 days ago, and made marvellous good speed, so that I hope to see the Lone Islands the day after tomorrow. The sum is, we are now nearly 30 days at seas, and have sailed more than 400 leagues from Narnia. And after the Lone Islands? Said Lucy. No one knows, your majesty, answered Durinian, unless the Lone Islanders themselves can tell us. They couldn't in our day, said Edmund. Then, said Reepicheep, it is after the Lone Islands that the adventure really begins. Caspian now suggested that they might like to be shown over the ship before supper, but Lucy's conscience smote her, and she said, I think I really must go and see Eustace. Seasickness is horrid, you know. If I had my old cordial with me, I could cure him. But you have, said Caspian. I've quite forgotten about it. As you left it behind, I thought it might be regarded as one of the royal treasures, and so I brought it. If you think it ought to be wasted on a thing like seasickness. It'll only take a drop, said Lucy. Caspian opened one of the lockers beneath the bench, and brought out the beautiful little diamond flask, which Lucy remembered so well. Take back your own, Queen, he said. Then they left the cabin, and went out into the sunshine. In the deck there were 2 large long hatches, fore and aft of the mast, and both open, as they always were in fair weather, to let light and air into the belly of the ship. Caspian led them down a ladder into the after hatch. Here they found themselves in a place where benches for rowing ran from side to side, and the light came in through the oar-holes and danced on the roof. Of course, Caspian's ship was not that horrible thing, a galley rowed by slaves. Oars were used only when the wind failed, or for getting in and out of the harbor, and everyone, except Reepicheep, whose legs were too short, had often taken a turn. At each side of the ship, the space under the benches was left clear for the rowers' feet, but all down the center there was a kind of pit which went down to the very keel, and this was filled with all kinds of things, sacks of flour, casks of water, and beer, barrels of pork, jars of honey, skin bottles of wine, apples, nuts, cheeses, biscuits, turnips, sides of bacon. From the roof, that is, from the underside of the deck, hung hams and strings of onions, and also the men of the watch often off duty in their hammocks. Caspian led them aft, stepping from bench to bench. At least it was stepping for him, and something between a step and a jump for Lucy, and a real long jump for Reepicheep. In this way they came to a partition with a door in it. Caspian opened the door and led them into a cabin which filled the stern underneath the deck cabin in the poop. It was of course not so nice. It was very low, and the sides sloped together as they went down, so there was hardly any floor, and though it had windows of thick glass, they were not made to open because they were under water. In fact, at this very moment, as the ship pitched, they were alternately golden with sunlight and dim green with the sea. You and I must lodge here, Edmund, said Caspian. We'll leave your kinsman the bunk and sling hammocks for ourselves. I beseech your majesty, said Drinian. No, no, shipmate, said Caspian. We have argued all that out already. You and Rince was the mate, are sailing the ship, and will have cares and labors many a night when we are singing catches or telling stories. So you and he must have the port cabin above. King Edmund and I can lie very snug here below. But how is the stranger? Eustace, very green in the face, scowled and asked whether there was any sign of the storm getting less. But Caspian said, "What storm?" And Drinian burst out laughing. "Storm, young master," he roared. "This is fair weather as a man could ask for." "Who's that?" said Eustace irritably. "Send him away. His voice goes through my head." "I brought you something that will make you feel better, Eustace," said Lucy. "Oh, go away and leave me alone," growled Eustace. But he took a drop from her flask, and though he said it was beastly stuff, the smell in the cabin when she opened it was delicious. It is certain that his face came the right color in a few moments after he swallowed it, and he must have felt better because, instead of wailing about the storm in his head, he began demanding to be put ashore, and said that at the first port he would lodge a disposition against them all with the British Council. But when Reepicheep asked what a disposition was and how you lodged it, Reepicheep thought it was some new way of arranging a single combat. Eustace could only reply, "Fancy not knowing that." In the end they succeeded in convincing Eustace that they were already sailing as fast as they could towards the nearest land they knew, and that they had no more power of sending him back to Cambridge, which was where Uncle Harold lived, than of sending him to the moon. After that he sulkily agreed to put on the fresh clothes which had been put out for him, and come on deck. Caspian now showed them over the ship, and though indeed they had seen most of it already, they went up on the forecastle and saw the lookout man standing on a little shelf inside the gilded dragon's neck and peering through its open mouth. Inside the forecastle was a galley or ship's kitchen, and quarters for such people as the boatswain, the carpenter, the cook, and the master archer. If you think it is odd to have a galley in the boat bows and imagine the smoke from its chimney streaming back over the ship, that is because you are thinking of steamships, where there is always a headwind. On a sailing ship the wind is coming from behind, and anything smelly is put as far forward as possible. They were taken up to the fighting top, and at first it was rather alarming to rock to and fro there and see the deck looking small and far away beneath. You realized that if you fell there was no particular reason why you should fall on board rather than in the sea. Then they were taken to the poop, where Rince was on duty, with another man at the great tiller, and behind that the dragon's tail rose up, covered with gilding, and round inside it ran a little bench. The name of the ship was Dwn Trdr. She was only a little bit of a thing compared with one of our ships, or even with the cogs, dromons, carracks, and galleons which Narnia had owned when Lucy and Edmund had reigned there under Peter as the High King, for nearly all navigation had died out in the reign of Caspian's ancestors. When his uncle, Miraz the usurper, had sent the 7 lords to sea, they had had to buy a Galmian ship and man it with hired Galmian sailors, but now Caspian had begun to teach the Narnians to be once more seafaring folk, and the Dwn Trdr was the finest ship he had built yet. She was so small that, forward of the mast, there was hardly any deck room between the central hatch and the ship's boat on one side, and the hen coop. Lucy fed the hens on the other. But she was a beauty of her kind, a lady, as sailors say, her lines perfect, her colors pure, and every spar and rope and pin lovingly made. Eustace, of course, would be pleased with nothing, and kept on boasting about liners and motorboats and aeroplanes and submarines, as if he knew anything about them, muttered Edmund. But the other 2 were delighted with the Dwn Trdr, and when they turned aft to the cabin and supper, and saw the whole western sky lit up with the immense crimson sunset, and felt the quiver of the ship, and tasted the salt on their lips, and thought of unknown lands on the eastern rim of the world, Lucy felt that she was almost too happy to speak.